From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There's good news. A good many members are now considering joining the impeachment effort, and I salute them. I am more than honored to say that you can never be too late when it comes to being on the right side of history and the right side of justice.
A growing number of House Democrats are calling on Speaker Nancy Pelosi to open an inquiry to impeach President Trump. We'll speak with Texas Congressman Al Green, the first to call for Trump's impeachment 2 years ago. Then we turn to a stunning investigation revealing the widespread use of solitary confinement in U.S. immigration jails.
I think one of the things that was most striking was the sheer number, and we're talking thousands and thousands, of immigrant detainees being placed into solitary confinement, sometimes for prolonged periods of time, in ICE detention centers, in conditions that are highly punitive and under international law amount to torture.
And we look at how a predatory lending scheme has put many New York taxi drivers into debilitating debt, creating a system that's been likened to modern-day indentured servitude.
I bought medallion from the city. I think city will help me, you know. I see on that. I know so many drivers, they kill themselves. But I have a family, my family. So I don't want to kill myself.
We'll speak with the New York Times reporter, Brian Rosenthal, who broke the story, which has prompted the launch of investigations by the New York City and state. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Calls for launching impeachment proceedings are growing among many House Democrats as President Trump continues to block congressional oversight efforts by refusing to hand over documents and by barring officials from testifying. However, the issue remains divisive as the chamber's leadership has thus far opposed the move. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's argued focusing on impeachment could hurt the chances of Democrats in the 2020 election. She's called for a closed-door special caucus meeting this morning to discuss the issue. We'll have more on impeachment after headlines with Houston Congressmember Al Green, the first to call for impeachment. The House Judiciary Committee has issued subpoenas to former White House Communications Director Hope Hicks and Annie Donaldson, former Chief of Staff to Don McGahn. The panel seeking documents and the two women's testimonies as they investigate Trump's potential obstruction of justice, corruption, and abuse of power. The news came as former White House counsel Don McGahn skipped his congressional hearing Tuesday after Trump directed him to defy a subpoena for his testimony. House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler warned again that McGahn could be cited for contempt if he continues to refuse cooperation with Congress. The Daily Beast reporting former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson met with leaders of the House Foreign Affairs Committee Tuesday about his time working for President Trump. He reportedly discussed his tense relationship with Trump's son-in-law and advisor Jared Kushner and Russian interference in the 2016 election. According to a congressional aide, Tillerson told lawmakers Trump actively avoided confronting Russia over the issue in an effort to fortify the White House's relationship with Moscow. The Washington Post reporting a confidential memo from the Internal Revenue Service states Congress has the right to request tax returns and that only an intervention by the president using executive privilege can stop it. This contradicts the reasoning given by the Trump administration for refusing to hand over his tax returns to Congress. As Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has argued, the refusal was based on the lack of legislative justification for requesting them. The IRS said the unsigned draft memo was written by a lawyer in the Office of Chief Counsel and did not represent the agency's official position. In more news from Capitol Hill, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, and intelligence agents met with members of the House and Senate for briefings on the situation with Iran. Shanahan said the U.S. had received, quote, credible intelligence about threats to our interests in the Middle East and to American forces. He also repeated an earlier refrain from the administration that the current U.S. strategy is about deterrence, not starting a war. Shanahan said the deterrence measures have been successful in putting on hold possible attacks on Americans for now. Senator Lindsey Graham relayed further details about the briefing to reporters.
They explained to us how the Iranian threat streams were different than in the past. that the attack on the ships and the pipeline was coordinated and directed by the Iranian government, the Ayatollah, that we'd picked up strong intelligence that they had given the Shiite militia basically more running room and direction, and that attacks against American interests and personnel were imminent.
But Democratic lawmakers questioned the briefing, which they said did not further clarify the administration's plans going forward. Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, warned about the risk of miscalculations on both sides and asked, what is this maximum pressure campaign trying to achieve? Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, condemned the U.S. decision to send a carrier strike group and a bomber task force to the region. In an interview with CNN, he said, having all these military assets in a small area is in itself prone to accidents. Extreme prudence is required, and the United States is playing a very, very dangerous game, he said. In related news, Iraq said it'll send delegations to Washington and Tehran in an attempt to, quote, halt tension. Iraq said it does not want war in the region 2 days after a rocket attack in Baghdad that the United States believes may have been linked to militia with ties to Tehran. Iran has rejected the claims. On Tuesday, reproductive rights defenders around the country took to the streets for a day of action against abortion bans. Hundreds of protests were organized to call out the wave of recent legislative attacks on reproductive rights after Alabama passed a near-total abortion ban last week, and states including Missouri, Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Ohio are attempting to enact different versions of highly restrictive bills. Planned Parenthood President Dr. Lena Wen addressed crowds outside the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C.
First, Trump and Pence fill the courts with judges willing to give politicians power and control over women's bodies. And we are looking at you, Brett Kavanaugh. And second, they started a misinformation campaign, manufacturing crises to cover up for what they are really doing. Which is third, they passed extreme bans in order to overturn Roe. Are we going to stand for that? No!
In more reproductive rights news, 24 states and municipalities have sued the federal government to block a new rule that would allow health care providers to decline abortions and other services for patients based on moral or religious beliefs. The Trump administration announced the plans earlier this month, and they're scheduled to go into effect in July. Under the new rules, transgender patients could also be subject to denial of care based on providers' personal beliefs. Meanwhile, blue states are moving to protect access to abortion. In Vermont, Democrats have approved a new bill that would prohibit the government from interfering with the right to get abortions. The measure, however, must first be approved by Republican Governor Phil Scott, whose spokesperson said he would sign off on the bill. Customs and Border Protection is halting the intake of any new migrant prisoners at the McAllen, Texas processing center following the death of a 16-year-old Guatemalan migrant who died after being diagnosed with the flu. Officials say they've identified a large number of likely flu cases. Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez was the 5th known migrant child to die while in Border Patrol custody since December. Before last year, no child died in immigration custody in more than a decade. In news from Syria, the State Department said Tuesday the Syrian government may have used chemical weapons during recent fighting in Idlib. The State Department warned the United States and its allies would respond quickly and appropriately if it's determined chemical weapons have been used. This all comes as new questions are being raised about an alleged chemical weapons attack in the city of Douma last year. The Syrian government was accused of dropping 2 gas cylinders on the city, killing dozens of people. The U.S. and allies responded by carrying out airstrikes, but a newly leaked internal document from the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons reveals there were conflicting views within the organization as to what happened. The leaked document suggests the cylinders were, quote, manually placed on the ground and were not dropped from the air. This has led some observers to conclude the chemical attack might have been staged by Syrian rebels. MIT professor Theodore Postel responded to the leaked document by stating, quote, as such, 35 deaths that were originally attributed to these staged chlorine events cannot be explained, and it cannot be ruled out that these people were murdered as part of the staging event, Professor Postel said. Back on Capitol Hill, House Democrats grilled Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson Tuesday. Boston Congressmember Ayanna Pressley pressed Carson on conditions in public housing.
There's a Miss Northcross, a mother and a grandmother living in Brighton in my district. She's raised her children and now cares for her grandchildren in property with thick mold on the walls. Her son was recently hospitalized, look at the pictures here, because of bone tumors in his arm and leg. He needs surgery to save and improve his quality of life, but he won't get it because the family must have a sanitary, stable housing condition first. Their actual home literally poses a risk of post-op injury and infection. Her question to you is, what do they become? When you raise children in these conditions, what can they become? So yes or no? Do Miss Norcross and her family deserve to live in these conditions because they are poor?
If you've listened to any...
Yes or no, do they deserve to live in these conditions because they are poor?
You know very well...
Would you let your grandmother live in public housing?
You know very well...
Would you let your grandmother live in public housing, yes or no?
You know very well...
Under your watch and at your helm, would you allow your grandmother to live in public housing under these conditions?
Congressmember Joyce Beatty asked Carson if he was familiar with OMWI. He appeared not to be. It stands for Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. A video of Congressmember Katie Porter questioning Carson went viral after the secretary mistakenly thought she was asking about Oreo cookies.
I'd also like you to get back to me, if you don't mind, to explain the disparity in REO rates. Do you know what an REO is?
An Oreo?
No, not an Oreo. An REO. REO.
Real estate?
What's the O stand for?
E, organization?
Owned. Real estate owned. That's what happens when a property goes to foreclosure. We call it an REO.
Secretary Carson tweeted a photo of himself holding a package of Oreo cookies and sent a family-sized box of double-stuffed Oreos to Congressmember Porter's office after the hearing. Porter responded to the gift by telling a reporter, "What I'm really looking for is answers." The Republican-controlled Senate confirmed Daniel Collins to a lifetime seat on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Tuesday. Collins has defended big oil companies like Shell and Occidental Petroleum against communities impacted by fossil fuel extraction and the effects of climate change. He's also refused to say whether the landmark Brown v. Board of Education ruling was correctly decided, and has filed briefs supporting the restriction of access to contraceptives through health insurance. In response to a recent New York Times report on the origins of New York City's taxi driver crisis, Mayor Bill de Blasio said the city would launch an investigation into the predatory practices of taxi medallion brokers. New York State Attorney General Letitia James announced her office is also initiating an investigation. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast. Austin Eubanks, a survivor of the 1999 Columbine mass shooting, an advocate for those suffering from addiction, was found dead in his home this past weekend. Eubanks became a public speaker on the issue of opioid addiction after battling with opioid abuse. He said he became addicted after being put on powerful painkillers to manage the pain from gunshot injuries sustained in the Columbine massacre, in which 2 students killed 12 fellow students and 1 teacher. While no official autopsy results have been released, Eubanks' family said in a statement Austin, quote, lost the battle with the very disease he fought so hard to help others face. And Roz Payne, a founding member and longtime archivist of the Newsreel Film Collective, has passed away. Formed in 1967 by filmmakers, photographers, and media workers, Newsreel produced and screened films on the Columbia University student strike, the Black Panthers, and anti-imperialism. Roz Payne wrote, "We decided to make films that would show another side to the news. It was clear to us that the established forms of media were not going to approach those subjects which threaten their very existence. Our films tried to analyze, not just cover the realities that the media, as part of the system, always ignores." And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. We begin today's show on Capitol Hill, where a growing number of House Democrats are calling on Speaker Nancy Pelosi to launch an impeachment inquiry against President Trump. The Speaker has called for a closed-door special caucus meeting this morning to discuss the impeachment question, which has deeply divided House Democrats. Pelosi has long opposed opening an impeachment inquiry, arguing that focusing on impeachment could hurt the chances of Democrats winning in the 2020 election. But she is facing growing pushback from other members of the House as President Trump continues to block congressional oversight efforts by refusing to hand over documents and by barring officials from testifying.
On Wednesday, former White House counsel Don McGahn defied a congressional subpoena. This was Tuesday, and skipped a House Judiciary Committee at the request of the White House. Earlier this month, Attorney General William Barr also skipped a House Judiciary Committee hearing, and at least one Republican supports impeachment. On Saturday, Michigan Congressmember Justin Amash broke with his party to become the first Republican lawmaker to publicly say President Trump has engaged in impeachable conduct. We're going to Capitol Hill right now to speak with Democratic Congressmember Al Green of Texas. In 2017, he became the first member of Congress to call for President Trump's impeachment. So the stakes are very high, Congressmember Green. Right after you talk to us, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, is holding a meeting with the Democrats as you push for her to open an inquiry into impeachment. Why are you calling for this, and why have you done this for the last 2 years?
Thank you for having me, Ms. Goodman and Mr. Gonzalez. I'm here because I love my country, and I have called for impeachment because I love my country. You see, we are now at a point wherein the House has to demonstrate its will. The framers of the Constitution have shown us the way. We have to demonstrate our will. We indicated that if you would just wait for the Mueller report, this would then give us reason to either move forward or not move forward. We have not moved forward as we should with impeachment. We have the Mueller report. And we're at a point now, Ms. Goodman, where the House itself is on trial in the court of public opinion. The question is, will we allow the time-honored system of checks and balances to be destroyed by this president? Your news report has indicated that he has resisted. In fact, he's stonewalling. He doesn't allow subpoenas. He doesn't allow witnesses to testify. And the question is, will he then amass this enormous amount of power that the framers never intended him to have? This is the equivalent of becoming a monarch. We don't want a monarchy. We want democracy. And impeachment is the means by which we maintain the check on the president so as to keep the balance of power.
And Representative Green, how do you respond to Speaker Pelosi's viewpoint that, first of all, that an impeachment proceeding, even if it were to move forward, would never be approved by the Senate in terms of removing the president, and that effectively the best way to move forward is toward the 2020 election to get to unseat President Trump?
Well, let's not bring Speaker Pelosi into this, because it's not about her. It's about democracy, not about Democrats, not about Republicans. It's about the Republic. So let me answer your question this way. Nowhere in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution does it say that the House must have a Senate that will agree with it. What it says is, if the president commits impeachable acts, then we must move forward. That's what it gives us the prerogative to do. It does not require that Republicans agree with us. It does not require that the public agree with us. What it requires is that we act on principle, not politics, that we put the people above our political party. It requires that we decide that we will not allow the moral imperative to be trumped by political expediency. This is really not about people in the House of Representatives. It's about the people in this country, and whether we are going to allow this president, who has demonstrated that he's ruthless, lawless, and reckless, whether we are going to allow him to destroy the system of checks and balances. We really don't have any other choice. We waited on the Mueller report. Now I hear that we may have a call for another investigation by the Judiciary Committee. We are destroying the power of the Judiciary Committee, the most powerful committee when it comes to this issue of impeachment. We are destroying it because we are requiring it to do more than is necessary. It is an awesome committee with awesome power. If we do this, we're setting a precedent by requiring the Judiciary Committee to get a vote from Congress before it can act on something that is clearly a part of its purview of power.
And what do you consider to be the key impeachable offenses that the president has committed?
The impeachable offenses are many. The Mueller report gives us a good deal of obstruction of justice that has been committed by the president. We can act on the obstruction of justice. But I also have contended and still contend that the president has infused his bigotry into policy. I think this is impeachable as well. I have indelibly imprinted in my brain that baby standing at the border crying while she is being separated from parents. This is not what a great country does. We cannot allow a president to talk about African countries as whole countries and then engage in the process of developing an immigration plan. We can't have a president who's going to say that they're very fine people among the biggest, the racists, the xenophobes, the homophobes who were in Charlottesville, where a woman lost her life protesting against bigotry, and do nothing about it. His bigotry is worthy of his being impeached. But his obstruction of justice is what I think a good many people will focus on. That obstruction of justice is something we cannot allow to go unchecked. 800 plus former prosecutors, federal prosecutors, have indicated that this president has obstructed justice, and were he anyone else, he would be impeached. He would be prosecuted if he were anyone else. In this country, if you run a stop sign and the police are aware of it, then you're going to pay a price. If you speed, you're going to pay a price. If you're a welfare mother and you defraud the welfare state of its money, which is the government of the United States of America, in the sense of welfare, then you're going to have to pay for that. We all pay for our crimes. No one is above the law. If the Congress doesn't act, what we are saying is the president is above the law, and it's okay to interfere with an investigation, which is critical to our investigative process to make sure people understand that you cannot do.
MSNBC's Mika Brzezinski recently questioned House Speaker Nancy Pelosi about Michigan Congressmember Justin Amash breaking with the Republican Party to support impeachment proceedings.
Doesn't it put more pressure on you that a conservative Republican says the threshold for impeachment has been met?
No.
No?
No.
Why?
Well, we have to, we're not, this isn't about politics, it's not about passion, it's not about prejudice, it's not about politics, it's about patriotism, and it's about the presentation of the facts so that the American people can see why we're going down a certain path.
During that same interview, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi suggested Democrats find common ground with Trump.
The American people elected him president, not by the popular vote, but by the college, the Electoral College. So I respect the office that he holds.
Okay.
And I think I respect the office that the president holds more than he respects the office that he holds. And I do believe that we must hold him accountable for to a high ethical standard, which he has not met, to integrity, level of integrity that he has not met, and actually a respect for governance, science, and other imperatives that we have. So this is, we have a moment, but the fact is that at the same time, we have to try to find common ground to work with him.
So, finding common ground, not impeaching. Your response, Congressmember Green, as you go in to meet with Nancy Pelosi right after this broadcast. Congressmember Green?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, I'm saying...
Oh, I'm sorry. I got the impression you were saying after we do something more, then I would
So
respond.
if you can respond to what House Speaker Pelosi said.
I'm honored to give you a response to the question of should we work with common ground with the president. I'll answer that question. Then this is not a response to Ms. Pelosi. Here is my response. I met with the president in Houston, Texas. The president and I shook hands, and the president said to me, "You're going to like me." And then he shook my hand again. And my retort within the confines of my mind was this: I'm going to like you, I'm going to love you because my religion requires that I love you. I love everybody, but I'm still going to impeach you. We can work with the president and still fulfill our constitutional responsibility. We must do so. Now, working with the president is not easy. He will give you an answer today, and then he will negate the answer tomorrow or later today, or perhaps in the same sentence that he gives you the answer. So I am all for working with the president, but I'm not for allowing the constitutional mandate that has been accorded the House of Representatives to be obliterated because we want to try to appease a president who clearly has demonstrated that he's not in the business of making reconciliation with us in any way. He doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to dictate. He will tell you, here's the deal. You can take it or leave it. I'm not a take it or leave it guy. I believe we can negotiate, but I will not be dictated to. Finally, this. This is about the moral authority of the House to move forward. This is about the moral imperative. We hear people saying you can lose the soul of the country if you don't handle this appropriately. Well, before we lose the soul of the country, the members of the House will have lost the soul of the House of Representatives. This is about us, 435 members of the House, who have been given this special place in history. This is about the framers of the Constitution who designed Article 2, Section 4 for a time such as this and a president such as Trump.
Congressman, I want to turn to a resurfaced clip of a President Trump ally, Senator Lindsey Graham. In 1999, the then Congressman Graham argued for the impeachment of President Bill Clinton for seeking to hide evidence of his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. This is what he said.
You don't even have to be convicted of a crime to lose your job in this constitutional republic. If this body determines that your conduct as a public official is clearly out of bounds in your role, because impeachment is not about punishment. Impeachment is about cleansing the office. Impeachment is about restoring honor and integrity to the office.
That was Lindsey Graham back in 1999. Your reaction?
Well, he was eminently correct then, and his words are as sound and as eminently powerful now as they were then. It is not about committing a crime. No president has to commit a crime to be impeached. If you read Federalist 65, not many people have, but if you do read it, you'll find that Hamilton, Jay, and Madison concluded that a president who does harm to society can be impeached. And they also went so far as to say that don't expect there to be harmony between the parties, that Democrats and Republicans are probably going to square off against each other. This is not going to be something that's a walk in the park, but it's a duty that we have taken on when we swore to uphold the Constitution. When we took that oath of office, this was one of the things that we said we would do when we have a ruthless, reckless president. So it's about us now. It's really about us. It's always about the president and about his behavior, but it's about us in terms of what we will do. This is our moment. Either we will honor ourselves in history, or a good many reputations are going to be tarnished when people who do these things by way of recording history, when they look through the vista of time and they see how we engaged in what Dr. King called the paralysis of analysis, how we did one thing after another to delay so that we could eventually get to an election day wherein we would then defeat him as opposed to impeach him. This is really not about defeating the president next year. It's about impeaching the president who's done the harm this year, and we cannot delay.
Congressmember Green, it seems like Trump welcomes an inquiry into impeachment to begin, and I'm wondering if you can talk about his point of view, thinking that it could serve him. Of course, the Senate is run by Republicans, where the trial would be. And just like with the Mueller report that you're holding as you speak to us, ultimately it found him, it exonerated him of collusion. Not corruption, which is a whole other issue, which are some of the questions that are being raised in the House right now through all of this questioning. But the idea that it would once again make President Trump look like the victim. If you could respond to perhaps you're playing right into his hands and then not moving forward with an agenda of getting the Green New Deal passed, getting Medicare for all, getting what so many new Congress members have been pushing for and saying they want a whole new, a whole new deal in every way, foreign and domestic.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate this question. I'm the kind of guy who wants the tough questions. I want to deal forthrightly with the issues, and you've put me in a position where I can do it. First point, the president doesn't want to be impeached. This is called reverse psychology. This is the kind of psychology that says, oh, go ahead and do that. That's really what I want, when he's bluffing. He does not want this on his record. Bigots, people who want to be autocrats, would-be dictators want to be loved. That's just why he has his cabinet members to praise him at cabinet meetings and talk about how great he is. Thank God for the Defense Secretary Manis, who refused to do it. He talked about the troops, not about the greatness of the president. With reference to those who would say, listen, we've got to work with him and love him and make sure that we can get our agenda over so that he can veto it, please, the president is not going to sign a Green New Deal. The Senate is not going to support a Green New Deal. People who would say, let's send a New Deal over to the Senate, and by the way, I think the people are practical and they're not thinking that the president is going to sign it, and they're not thinking that how the Senate is going to approve it. I don't think they believe that. I think they're as I am. They understand that we do our job. I think this makes the case for impeachment because we will do our job when it comes to passing legislation that we know the president's not going to support and the Senate won't sign off on, but we'll send it to them and say, do your job. This is what we have to do. Give the Senate an opportunity to act. With reference to the trial in the Senate, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides. He makes rulings and he does them in a transparent fashion before the world. We will have an opportunity to see the request for subpoenas and the ruling of John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has no role in this process. It is an inferior court to the Senate when it comes to impeachment. All of the courts are inferior. This is where impeachment takes place. The trial of impeachment takes place. The impeachment itself takes place in the House, but the trial takes place in the Senate. And this is where you'll see the witnesses testify. The president himself can be called as a witness before the Senate to give his testimony. This is not just another trial wherein Mr. McConnell will have his way and the Senate can dominate. This is presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States of America, and the American people are in a position to see. Finally, this. If this Senate decides they are not going to impeach, if they decide that they're not going to, convict, they're not going to find that the president has committed the impeachable acts alleged. If the Senate concludes this, then we'll know which senators we ought to review, and we'll know what to do, and that will energize people to say, you know what? Maybe we need some new senators over there in the Senate. And if we don't impeach, here's what the president will say. He will say that the Democrats had the House by overwhelming numbers. He will say that they did not impeach me. He will say by their inaction, I have been vindicated, I have been exonerated. Mr. Mueller did not exonerate him. Why would the House of Representatives exonerate him? And he will say, by virtue of this, you ought to elect me, meaning him, President Trump, president again. And let me share this with you. He will make a powerful argument that we were complicit, in a sense, in his actions by not having our action in the House of Representatives.
Congressmember Al Green, I want to thank you for being with us. Texas Democrat from Houston. In 2017, he became the first Congressmember to call for President Trump's impeachment from the floor of the House of Representatives. He goes from here to his meeting with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She's meeting with the Democratic caucus around the issue of impeachment as a group of scores of Democrats attempt to convince her to open an inquiry around impeachment. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, immigrants in solitary detention, and then we will look at this explosive expose in the New York Times around how taxi drivers were fleeced of hundreds of thousands of dollars and why so many have taken their own lives. Stay with us.
There is a song for every voice, comforting words to sing and rejoice. Give me your hand, together we'll reap the most beautiful garden you've ever seen. There is a place we have yet to know, one that we speak of but haven't roamed. Give me your hand, let's take the lead. Tell our sisters and brothers, home is here with me. There is a sinner inside us all. There is a giver who's taken the fall.
Most Beautiful Garden by Oh Liz. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a damning investigation revealing the widespread abusive use of solitary confinement in immigration jails overseen by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture says solitary confinement should only be used in exceptional circumstances and defines extended use of solitary as inhuman and degrading treatment. Despite this, a new devastating report by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reveals that since 2012, ICE has used solitary confinement as a routine punishment for thousands of immigrants and asylum seekers locked up in immigration jails across the country.
The review of more than 8,400 reports of solitary confinement and ICE detention found immigration officers repeatedly used isolation cells to punish gay, transgender, and disabled immigrants for their identities and to target other jailed immigrants for actions like kissing consensually or hunger striking. Almost a third of the people held in solitary confinement suffered from mental illness. In at least 373 cases, immigrants were put in isolation for being potentially suicidal. In nearly 200 instances, immigrants were held in solitary confinement for more than half a year. The investigation's called Solitary Voices. This is an excerpt of a video released along with the report.
You're being locked up 23 hours, 22 hours in a day in a small room.
It's like a cage, you know? It made me feel like going crazy. You can't even talk to nobody. I contemplated, trying to hurt myself, kill myself, because I just couldn't bear being alone. It's hard. It's really hard.
It's presented as though it's a form of protection when, in fact, the experience of the individual is this is extreme punishment. If the only way you can assure the safety of civil detainees who are extremely vulnerable based on their background or their mental or physical health is to put them into a 24-hour, 22-hour lockdown, I think it raises a profound question about the overall system.
That was Ellen Gallagher, Department of Homeland Security Policy Advisor and a whistleblower who repeatedly warned immigration officials that ICE was in violation of its own standards. Solitary Voices is an investigation by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in collaboration with a number of other news outlets.
Congressmember Ilhan Omar shared the investigation on Twitter Tuesday, writing, "Solitary confinement is torture. It's time we abolish ICE," she wrote. Well, for more, we're joined here in New York by Spencer Woodman, staff reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and lead reporter for the new investigative series Solitary Voices. Welcome to Democracy Now! Great to have you with us. So lay out what you found and how you went about doing this report.
Sure. So we found that ICE has repeatedly overused and misused solitary confinement to manage its sprawling detention network. The report is based on 8,500 incident reports describing that we obtained through the Freedom of Information Act request, describing individual placements of detainees in solitary confinement. We also interviewed dozens of these detainees who have spent time, sometimes very prolonged periods of time, up to a year in solitary confinement cells at ICE facilities. And along the way, we got wind of a whistleblower who has a supervisory role within the Department of Homeland Security, who has for years been trying to affect change internally through formal whistleblowing channels at DHS with little luck. And yesterday she came out publicly for the first time to tell her story.
Now, most Americans are not aware that people being held by ICE in these detention facilities, these are basically, they're under civil penalties. They're not under, they're not being detained for crimes necessarily, right? Can you talk about the distinction and the importance of that in terms of solitary?
That's right. Under U.S. law, and the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed this, civil detention cannot be used as a for any form of punishment. It's not punitive in nature. And what we're seeing in immigrant detention in the United States are highly punishing forms of solitary confinement being used on detainees routinely and in many cases as a first resort to manage these facilities. It might be worth it to just kind of step back for a second and talk about what a solitary confinement cell is, because before I started doing this reporting, I didn't totally know what a solitary confinement cell is. I mean, it's not the sort of jail cell you think of with bars on one side and stuff like that. The important thing to remember is that a solitary confinement cell, actually, it's a bathroom-sized room that you're locked in, of course, but it has a solid metal door with, typically with a small window encased with safety glass. And when they close and lock that solid metal door, you are in a armored, sealed box. And you can't get out, and you can't, there is no opportunity to speak with anyone. If you want to have a conversation, get something off your chest, get some fresh air, you can't get out of that little room, and if you yell out, you can be additionally sanctioned to more time in solitary.
We're showing a door that says suicide safe. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, it has been shown over and over again that people held for long periods of time in solitary become more suicidal.
Right. So, I mean, suicidality is one of the among the long list of very serious harms that are well known and well documented that result from being in solitary confinement. One of the things that was quite striking that we came across were hundreds of reports of detainees becoming suicidal in solitary confinement, and then because of their suicidal impulses or even suicide attempts in solitary confinement, being moved to another solitary confinement cell designed to manage suicidal detainees, which are some of these cells are actually more harsh than the cells that drove these detainees to attempt suicide in the first place.
Tell us a little bit about how you got onto this story, because you had initially filed a Freedom of Information request and had gone for a couple of years without any response, and why it was necessary to have an international group of journalists throughout Latin America participate in the uncovering of a story that was basically here in the United States.
Sure. So, yeah, in early 2017, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with ICE asking for agency-wide logs of their placements of detainees in solitary confinement. I had filed a few similar requests of narrower scope around that same time, and I actually, after a few months, I had forgotten I filed this larger request. And about 2 years later, I opened my mailbox to find a letter from ICE with a CD containing a huge trove of thousands and thousands of these incident reports. So that is what basically started the investigation. And ICIJ, where I work, we typically partner with international news organizations to do stories that cross borders.
You did the Panama Papers.
We did the Panama Papers. And so this was a pretty good opportunity to both get the story out to a Spanish language audience and also work with reporters who work in populations who have been affected by solitary confinement at ICE. So,
I want to go to a clip from an NBC interview with two trans women who were held in isolation while in ICE custody. In this clip, you'll hear from Dulce Rivera, a trans woman from Honduras who was kept in solitary confinement for 11 months while in ICE custody and attempted suicide. But first, this is Jocelyn Mendez, a trans woman from Nicaragua who was put in solitary confinement twice for a total of 9 days.
And well, the truth is, what I went through in there is something I don't even wish on my worst enemy. It's horrible. I felt like I really didn't know what was going to happen to me. I felt afraid. I felt that I couldn't even breathe. And at the beginning, I began to scream and scream where they locked me up. I told them, release me. I can't stand it. I am short of breath.
I asked them for help. I told them, I need to see a psychologist. I need to see a psychologist. And what happened is that the guard's response was no. So then I decided to tie a piece of blanket to the window above.
And
I completely covered the door outside so that no one was seeing what was happening inside the room. I made a lasso I hung myself. So it's something psychological, mental, that it affected me in being in that place. So disgusting and horrible.
So that was Dulce Rivera in an NBC report. She is from Honduras, originally held in an El Paso processing center. Now I want to turn to a video from the series Solitary Voices. This is Ilyas Muradi, a 30-year-old from Afghanistan who came to the U.S. when he was 12. Muradi has spent most of the last 4 months in solitary at ICE's South Texas detention complex.
My first name is I-L-Y-A-S, Ilyas Muradi. I'm in a solitary at the moment myself. It's like a cage, you know? The door has a little tiny window in it. There is nothing to see. Seems like I woke up in a nightmare.
Headline: the United States retaliates for the bomb.
I was born in Afghanistan. My father got killed with the bomb in Afghanistan. We got accepted as a refugee to come to the United States. I was 12 going 13.
Muradi became a truck driver and had 2 children. He says his permanent resident card was extended in 2017, but months later, U.S. immigration officials stopped him on the way back to Mexico.
They pulled me out of that car. They said that all my papers are wrong. I should have left the country. They arrested me. I've been sitting since 2017 here, and I appealed my case, and the Border of Appeal rejected.
Now Muradi expects to be deported back to Afghanistan.
I have no idea about the country. Every time when I think about it, going there, I get scared, you know? I don't know what's going to happen.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement said Muradi has been put in solitary confinement 7 times for disorderly conduct. When ICIJ reporters talked to him in March and April, he had been in solitary for more than a month.
You think you'll go crazy. I force myself instantly trying to go to sleep or trying to read. You don't have any more hopes.
On April 17th, Muradi was briefly released from isolation. On April 26th, he was locked up again for threatening a staff member and other misconduct, ICE said.
Sometimes you just sit down and be sad and cry. You're 20 to 22 hours a day in the cell by yourself. You get to go outside and then like a little box. All you can see is the sky. Everything else is 4 walls. And all I see is one's gonna be the day I can be free, so I don't have to see these walls in front of me, so I can just see freedom.
And that's Ilyas Muradi, 30-year-old from Afghanistan, has been in this country since he was 12 years old, spent most of the last 4 months in solitary in ICE's South Texas detention complex. And Spencer, we're listening to him on the telephone. Explain how you even recorded this.
So Ilyas called me, and, you know, detainees who are put in solitary confinement, their privileges can be severely curtailed. They can, at some point, get access to phone privileges. So that basically means a detention officer hands a phone through the meal slot in that solid metal door and allows them to talk on the phone, usually kind of huddled up to the door because the phone cord isn't very long. So that was him, that was Ilyas Muradi in his solitary confinement cell talking to me. You know, it's worth noting that people who are already in psychological distress are much more prone to the worst harms of solitary confinement. And a lot of people in immigration detention are under a lot of stresses. I mean, they've been, in many cases, separated from their families. In a lot of cases, they're pending removal back to countries where they might not be safe. So this is the case of Ilyas Muradi, and, you know, the psychological decompensation that happens in solitary confinement was pretty obvious talking to him. There were certain points where he broke down and he wasn't really able to have a conversation. And that kind of that difficulty socializing and just that basic emotional distress we found over and over again when we talked to particularly people in solitary confinement, the difficulty to even have a conversation.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but we will link to your piece. Spencer Woodman, a staff reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, lead reporter on this new investigative series, Solitary Voices, on the widespread misuse of solitary confinement in ICE detention centers. When we come back, we'll look at how a predatory lending scheme has put many New York taxi drivers into debilitating debt, creating a system that's been likened to modern-day indentured servitude. Back in 30 seconds.
Bésame mucho, como si fuera esta noche la última vez. Bésame, bésame mucho, que tengo miedo a tenerte y perderte después. Quiero tenerte muy cerca, mirarme en tus ojos, verme junto a ti. Piensa que tal vez mañana yo ya estaré lejos, muy lejos de ti. Bésame, bésame mucho, como si fuera esta noche la...
David Garza and Paulina Berza here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a new investigation by the New York Times exposes the financial schemes at the root of the New York City taxi driver crisis. The report reveals that a group of industry leaders artificially inflated the cost of taxi medallions and orchestrated a predatory lending scheme, collecting millions of dollars in the process and putting many drivers into debilitating debt. City agencies did little to curb the system, which a Harvard professor was quoted in the report called modern-day indentured servitude. In response to the Times report, Mayor Bill de Blasio said Monday the city would launch an investigation into the predatory practices of taxi medallion brokers.
New York State Attorney General Letitia James announced her office is also initiating an investigation. While the advent of rider apps like Uber and Lyft contributed to a loss of income for licensed taxi drivers, the investigation finds the taxi medallion bubble helped lay the groundwork for the current driver crisis. At least 8 drivers have died by suicide, including 3 taxi medallion owners since the start of 2018, with at least some of the drivers linking to their crushing debt. To more we go to now. We're joined by the story's author, the investigative reporter Brian Rosenthal. Welcome to Democracy Now! An incredible expose. Every day another investigation is being launched based on your original report. Brian, just lay out what you found.
Basically, we found a financial bubble in the taxi medallion industry, very similar to the obviously much larger bubble in the real estate industry. And we found that the price of these medallions, that's the permit that's required to operate a cab in New York City, had grown from $200,000 in 2002 up to over $1 million by 2014, even though there hadn't been any change in what the cab could generate on the road. And we found that the reason for that was really people in the industry leaders artificially inflating the price and then making hundreds of millions of dollars by providing these reckless loans to drivers interested in buying medallions.
And interestingly, you noted that it was under first Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio that the city actually made a lot of money off increasing the controlled number of medallions, right? I think it was about 1,000 under Bloomberg, another 1,000 or so under de Blasio. And interestingly, de Blasio himself had huge campaign contributions from the taxi, the yellow cab industry, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's really interesting about this asset as opposed to real estate or anything else. This is something that was sold by the city. And we found that the city actually knew that the prices were inflated, but still sold these medallions at these very high prices. Between Bloomberg and de Blasio, they made more than $855 million off of these medallion sales. And yeah, we did find a lot of political connections between the industry and not just Bill de Blasio, but also Governor Cuomo and Senator Alphonse D'Amato, who was responsible for some of this back in the day. We found that the taxi industry is one of the more politically connected industries, and it's really used that influence.
I want to turn to a clip from the Weekly. This is one of the taxi drivers that you profiled in your New York Times piece. This is Mohammed Hussein.
I bought medallion from the city. I think city will help me, you know. I see on that. I know so many drivers, they kill themselves, but I have a family, I love my family. So I don't want to kill myself. My life is more important for my family. I love my family than medallion.
That's Mohammed Hussein. Tell us more about him and tell us about the root of this problem.
He is one of those people that bought a medallion at an auction. He was unlucky enough to buy at the final auction, and he thought that he was making a decision that was going to not just improve his life, but improve his family's life for generations to come.
He paid?
He paid $890,000. He got a loan for the vast majority of that, but he did pour his life savings into the purchase, and now he is underwater and can't pay that back.
Could you talk about the racial aspect of this, the changing demographics of the taxi industry, just as increasing people from Asia and a lot of Indians and Pakistanis became taxi drivers, medallion owners, was when the predatory practices sort of skyrocketed?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back in history, the taxi driver in New York used to be kind of a classic New Yorker. I think we have this image from the TV show Taxi, which is before my time. But in recent years, 91% of taxi drivers were born outside the United States. 40% of them were born in South Asia. But that was a factor that really contributed to this, because a lot of the people that were buying these medallions did not speak English fluently, did not necessarily understand what they were signing up for, and that left them vulnerable.
Can you talk about those that have benefited being similar to, as you've said, or perhaps the same as those who benefited from the housing market crash in 2008 and 9?
Yeah, we found a lot of similarities. Similar lenders issuing the loans, but also the lending practices themselves. These no down payment loans, these balloon loans where there's a teaser rate that looks good at first, but it's going to cost you later, and these interest-only loans, and really a lot of practices that created a lot of profits for banks, but were very risky.
And what about the impact of Uber and Lyft and the black car industry? Because clearly there are about 13,000 yellow cabs in New York, but there are more than 60,000, as I understand, of black cabs and others that are doing working for Lyft or Uber and these others. What impact did that have on the ability of these drivers to be able to get sufficient money to pay off these medallions?
Yeah, it's had an impact, no doubt about it. But one of the things we found in our story was it's actually had a smaller impact than you might think. Part of the reason is why is that 97% of taxi rides are either in core of Midtown Manhattan or at the airports. And the majority of Uber and Lyft are in the outer boroughs. So if you look at the revenue per cab, it's only down by about 10% since Uber and Lyft came. But the problem is that they were operating on such a thin margin, and it was so unsustainable and so unstable already that even that relatively small revenue drop led to this huge catastrophe.
Talk about the investigations. Now, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, Bill de Blasio, the city mayor. What will these investigations do?
Well, it's still very early, so we're not exactly sure. But the Attorney General has said that she's going to look at the lending practices and see if they violated any laws related to predatory lending. And the mayor has said that he's going to look at the brokers, which is the area that he can control the most, and see if they engaged in any predatory lending practices in arranging these loans.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here, Brian Rosenthal. We're going to do part 2 of our discussion and post online at DemocracyNow.org. Brian Rosenthal, investigative reporter for the New York Times. His report on the New York City taxi medallion scam is headlined, "They Were Conned, How Reckless Loans Devastated a Generation of Taxi Drivers." And that does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!